So we are going to have a book discussion of CESRAN 2023. And we have this book. I would like to show it to you just for marketing reasons. We have a discount code in our program. So you can use it if you like the discussion session and delve into the broader aspect and reading the book. So please let me start with thanking the author, Joshua Cherniss, if I'm not pronounce it wrongly.
That's
Joshua
correct.
Cherniss. Okay. Let me give you small and short bio of Associate Professor Joshua Cherniss is political theorist whose research interests range over the history of political ideas. His work has mostly focused on European and American political thought in the 20th century. It's more about interplay between political ethics, philosophies of history, and the liberal thought. You see that he has focused on the liberal development of ideas. So his book, recent book, is about liberalism in dark times, the liberal ethos in the 20th century. When I first looked at the title, I was wondering about the liberal ethos. What was it and what does it mean? So we will have an opportunity to see what is it about. And the book is mostly covering the dark times. It's 20th century. It means First World War, Second World War, and mostly ideologically polarized Cold War. So we have three, sometimes different names included in the chapters, but still majorly three philosophers and thinkers. They had been passing through the dark ages. So he's now gonna give us a short, not short, maybe half an hour information about the book, and then we are gonna move on the Q&A session. I have my question ready, so if you ask more questions, then I don't need to ask anyone. But still, all set for the discussion. Okay, then. So it's better to give the floor to Associate Professor Joshua. So if you are ready, son, please go on and start your thinking. It's half an hour at most, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. And I will certainly take less than half an hour so that we do have some more time for discussion. But just give a broad overview of what I was trying to do and hope that I have done in the book. The book seeks to do primarily three things, and there is a fourth thing which it gestures at, and some readers have perhaps expected it to do, which it perhaps does less well. But I want to focus on the three primary goals and I think contributions the book makes. First of all, it presents a historical account. As you've already heard, a historical account of political thought in the 20th century, or in what we might call the short 20th century between the First World War, the start of the First World War, and the end of the Cold War, although most of the focus is on the interwar period and the early Cold War. And this is a period that is marked by many crucial developments, many epochal developments, but one important strand in thinking about and practicing politics in this period is a critique of and a revision of liberalism. Now, by liberalism here, I'm talking about a fairly broad tradition. Liberalism is a frequently used, widely invoked, and vaguely defined or contentiously defined term. And I offer a definition of it or an account of it, which I think is faithful to many of the uses of the term in the period I'm looking at, although those uses varied quite a bit. And so I do abstract somewhat from them and offer a stylized account of liberalism as a set of political practices which aim at limiting the power particularly of the state, but also limiting the power of certain non-state actors, and doing so for the sake of defending individual freedom. And individual freedom understood in a number of different ways, certainly encompassing the idea of what's called, thanks largely to one of the subjects of my book, Isaiah Berlin, what's called negative liberty, freedom from interference, what some people have called market freedom or liberal freedom, the idea of freedom as the ability of individuals to make choices about the conduct of their own lives, but also freedom of political participation, freedom of development, freedom of development of character in various ways. And the liberal program or liberal philosophy not only emphasizes this goal of protecting and promoting individual freedom, it also invokes a certain set of practices and institutions to do so. Limited government, divided government, representative government, constitutionalism, the protection of civil liberties, the division of society, thinking about society and social practice between a state and a civil society. These are various hallmarks of most, if not all, liberal theories, which all, in their different ways, seek to limit power and seek to divide up the social and political world, to provide shelters for individuals. If things are not going well politically, if your party is not in power, there are other outlets for you. If your religious beliefs differ from those of the majority, there is still a space of private worship, a space of private gathering and community where you are safe and where you can realize your articulate and perform your religious beliefs. This comes under attack. This liberal vision of politics and practice of politics comes under attack in the 20th century. And the story is fairly familiar to historians of 20th century political thought and to many of us. The story of the great anti-liberal ideologies of the 20th century, Marxian socialism, particularly Marxism, Leninism, communism, fascism, Nazism, and various other ideologies of the right. And the way that the story is told often focuses on these institutional matters or on broader philosophical matters, philosophies of human nature, philosophies of history, philosophies of or theories of justice, or programs for economic governance, or programs for expansion of the state into more and more fields of human life. And this is all certainly crucial. But what the book seeks to do first is to demonstrate that this was also a conflict between liberals and anti-liberals over matters of ethics. And by ethics, I mean two related things. One are ideals of character and ideals of personal development. Liberalism, as a number of historians have recently emphasized, not only involves a certain institutional program or a set of practices, it also involves a vision of how human beings should conduct themselves in public life, how they should relate to one another, and hopes for the kinds of character that might be developed, characters of tolerance, self-restraint, independence, openness, experimentation, and also a fair amount of forbearance, the ability to hold oneself back from interfering with others. These are all features of liberal character, as well as a certain moderation and openness to compromise. All of this is attacked by anti-liberals and attacked as an inglorious or debased conception of character. There is a rival conception of character, a much more heroic and one might say a great type of character, which is seen as really being under threat or prone to debasement within liberal societies. There's also relatedly a second sense of ethics, the sense of political ethics, ideas about what is the right sort of behavior, the best sort of behavior, the best sort of conduct, and the best dispositions of character to bring to bear on politics. And again, liberalism is identified with a political ethics that emphasizes moderation, compromise, toleration, gradualism, a certain sense of responsibility, a certain pragmatism and flexibility combined with respect for certain procedural rules, procedural principles. And against this, there is an anti-liberal view of political ethics, which varies in its articulation, which has different nuances, but which broadly, I argue, involves a mixture of absolutism about goals or ultimate ends, the idea that ultimate goals cannot be, must not be compromised, must not be delayed too much, must be pursued with great determination and single-mindedness, combined with great flexibility or realism, as one might call it, about means, the idea. And these two things go together. The idea is that if you are truly committed, as you should be, to the correct ends of political action, you should adopt and embrace whatever means are necessary to achieve those ends. But more than this anti-liberalism involves not only a certain view of ethics or an ideal of character, but bringing the two together, what I call an ethos, a certain conception and practice of the right spirit, the right set of dispositions, the right temperament for engaging in political action, an ethos of ruthlessness, an ethos of hard-heartedness, sometimes brutality, certainly callousness, certainly closed-mindedness to other perspectives or other considerations that might distract from or interfere with the pursuit of the one thing needful, the one ultimate goal. And so the first step and the first contribution of the book is to simply document and bring out this strand in 20th century political argument. Drawing from that, or growing out of that, there is a second, more theoretical or perhaps methodological goal, which is to bring this idea of ethos into focus and to draw on the historical materials I'm discussing to try to develop ethos as a conceptual tool for thinking about politics, thinking about matters of political ethics, which are often thought about or approached in terms of general ethical theories, consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. The idea or the frameworks of ethos has a certain amount of affinity with virtue ethics, although I would argue that it's not quite identical. But arguing that we should, in thinking about the ethics of political life, also pay attention to the way in which certain conceptions of ethos can inform and guide how we're both formulating problems and also thinking about responses to those problems. And also to use ethos as a tool for analyzing political movements or political thinkers, showing how, as I said in the first point, the debate between, or the conflict between liberals and anti-liberals is shaped by rival conceptions and rival practices of ethos, as well as theoretical disagreements and disagreements over policy. The third step, or the third contribution, is bringing together this general historical framing of the conflict between liberals and anti-liberals over questions of ethics, and this framework of thinking about liberalism and its challengers or opponents in terms of different ethi, as I believe the correct Greek plural is, or ethos is, if you prefer, to reconstruct and to reinterpret a certain set of liberal thinkers who, I argue, are all deeply preoccupied with these ethical problems and with the ethical critique of liberalism by anti-liberals, also preoccupied with what I call the liberal predicament, which is an ethical dilemma facing liberals, faced by ruthless, fanatical, at the same time politically unprincipled anti-liberals, which is when your opponents are behaving or are acting ruthlessly in their pursuit of political power and their use of political power, how do you respond? Do you emulate that ruthlessness? Do you adopt the same spirit and the same approach of ruthlessness? The idea being that you need to fight fire with fire. Or do you resist? Do you remain true to principles of self-restraint, respect for fundamental rights, respect for absolute principles of justice, even though you know that this may hamper your political effectiveness and allow your opponents who are not constrained by such rules or such scruples to triumph politically, and to therefore potentially, as we see in much of the 20th century and beyond, to destroy what liberal institutions or liberal practices exist. So there is, among thinkers who are often called Cold War liberals, not a label that I particularly like using, there is a strand, not among all of them, but among some of them, and among those I'm focused on here, that is preoccupied with this liberal predicament, preoccupied with the ethical critique of liberalism that anti-liberals advance, and that seeks to re-articulate liberalism in terms of a certain ethos or ethical approach, marked by various dispositions, various features of character and conduct, including, notably, this idea of forbearance, this idea of resolute determination in the face of opposition, in the face of attack, which does not resort to ruthlessness, which does uphold certain fundamental liberal values, which retains a degree of toleration for and respect for the rights of others, but which also does not back down and does not assume that approaches of traditional liberalism appeal to rational argument, appeal to rational ideals, appeal to economic interests, is going to be enough to counteract or to win against anti-liberalism. It's also an ethos that is marked by a certain, this I think comes out of what I've just said, marked by a certain tragic sense, a sense of the deep vulnerability or fragility of political order and the way that politics frequently can go very wrong. And that therefore is, again, determined but fairly modest in its expectations or in its hopes, not cynical or despairing, but that eschews excessive optimism, or what's often called utopianism. And as I think they try to show, the goal here is not to promote resignation or apathy. On the contrary, this is based on a certain, and I think a quite subtle and revealing analysis of the psychology of political idealism, the way in which political idealists frequently go into political struggle, or go into political work with high expectations, which then run up against the harsh and the murky realities of politics, which creates tremendous disillusionment, tremendous disappointment and frustration, which then generates the kind of either cynicism or fanaticism, or the combination of both, that is a marked feature of anti-liberal movements. So part of the idea of offering a modestly hopeful, but not optimistic and not utopian and not overly ambitious account of the nature of politics and way of thinking about the goals of politics is to guard against this dynamic of excessive hopes, excessive goals, disillusionment, and a turn to either resignation and apathy or to fury and ruthlessness in response. The figures I look at and who I read as articulating this position, which I call tempered liberalism, liberalism that is both focused on matters of personal temperament and that it's also tempered in its own expectations and goals by encounters with anti-liberalism, and that argues for a tempered idealism, a tempered optimism. The figures who I look at primarily are associated with this idea of Cold War liberalism, even though there are many Cold War liberals, so-called, who I don't talk about here and who are not part of this strand of tempered liberalism. The figures are, in rough chronological order, Max Weber, who serves as a kind of precursor and anticipation of these later figures, and someone whose own liberalism is much more ambivalent and ambiguous. Then Reinhold Niebuhr in the United States, Raymond Aron in France, Isaiah Berlin in Britain primarily, and Albert Camus again, mostly in France. The figures who all were anti-communists during the Cold War, who were anti-fascists or anti-Nazis earlier, who were, broadly speaking, identified with European social democracy and American liberalism, which is to say very moderate social democracy, but who also all, I argue, were distinctive in their preoccupation with and their focus on questions of political ethics and their embrace, in some cases, their belated embrace of liberalism as an ethical disposition and position. And I note in the book that nearly all of these figures, Berlin may be an exception, were tempted towards anti-liberalism at certain points. And some of them did indeed come to liberalism eventually after first embracing much more radical politics and recognizing some of the dangers in those more radical politics, but also bringing something of their radical background to the rearticulation of liberalism. And this, I think, is another important historical point, that tempered liberalism is not liberal fundamentalism. It's not a return to an earlier and more dogmatic form of liberalism. It's informed by an attempt to really reckon with and really learn from the ways in which 19th century liberalism had failed, or had proved inadequate to address the problems that it encountered, and in some cases, the problems that it generated. And so there's actually a fair amount of flexibility and pragmatism about various liberal institutions. Many of these figures, all of these figures really, embraced a mixed market economy rather than a laissez-faire economic program. They all recognized that there would have to be considerable innovations in the institutions of government. They also recognized the need to reconstruct liberal theory, to be much less optimistic, less rationalistic. So Niebuhr seeks to articulate a form of liberal democratic thought and practice that is grounded in his own version of Augustinian Christianity. Berlin draws from Romantic thought extensively. Camus draws from both Augustinian Christianity and Romanticism and existentialism. Aron is somewhat more faithful to the liberal tradition intellectually, or more deeply shaped by it, but he also is very interested in the work of socialist economists, including Marx and his successors. So there is an attempt to move beyond classical liberalism or earlier liberalism, to transform it, but also to retain this sort of ethical core that these figures see as crucial to liberalism, and as recognizing the wisdom of liberalism, the wisdom that it suggests that the dangers and the self-defeating quality or the self-defeating tendency of seeking justice, seeking liberation, seeking equality with a ruthless spirit and with ruthless methods. The idea that if you embrace ruthlessness and if you embrace dogmatism and fanaticism, you will be led to produce a politics, a political order, and a practice of politics that is antithetical to visions of liberation or equality or justice. So all of this, as many readers have recognized, does point to another potential contribution, which is much more contemporary, much more practical, which is to offer some sort of prognosis about the prospects of liberalism, and also some sort of prescription of how liberals should respond to today's dark times. And I make some slight gestures in this direction in the conclusion of the book, which some readers have found inadequate, and which I think are inadequate, primarily because the book is a work of history and a work of political theory, a work of interpretation and analysis. It would require much more engagement with empirical political science and with political psychology, with social economic trends, to really offer a prescription for what to do now. And that's not something that I am really competent to do. So what I've tried to do is to offer food for thought, offer resources for thinking, and offer, I hope, some suggestions about political ethics and political ethos, and the kind of approach that in general may be dangerous or destructive, and the kind of approach that it will, I hope, help us to respond to the challenges that we face better in a more humane and also a more practically effective way. But the job of figuring out what to do now is a job for all of us as citizens, all of us as scholars, and I think particularly the many of you who study empirical political science and therefore can hopefully bring the lessons of the past to bear much more directly and constructively on the present. So that is a little under half an hour, and we'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Yeah, I was hoping you stop there because you will delve into my questions, and if you already answered my questions, then nothing to ask that I left. So it's good that you stopped there. Okay, but before talking about the contemporary, how can the book give a projection about the political rivalries in Europe in liberal democracies? But I need to first try to clarify about the temperate liberalism and the classical liberalism, or other types of liberalism. You have mentioned that the neoliberalism and difference between temperate and the neoliberal perspective, but still, because I have another question based on the answer you will give that question. So what is the clear difference between the temperate liberalism and the classical or other types of liberalism? Because if there is just the liberal ethos, that means that it might be more than individual, and the individuality and the individual rights is the base in the classical liberalism. So they might change the basic core of liberalism into a bit group solidarity, or maybe social, spiritual togetherness, or something like that. So that's why I have read the book, and I have got my answer, half of the answer from the book, but still it's better if you could just elaborate it a little bit more between difference between liberalism, temperate liberalism, and the other types of liberalism. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and you've already suggested responses to it that wouldn't necessarily have occurred to me, but which I think are on target and correct and important. So there is this element that you point to of the difference between a liberalism that is more individualistic and that emphasizes a picture of individuals as fundamentally independent and self-interested and very mobile creatures, and an approach to liberalism that is more solidaristic, that places much more emphasis on group identity and also on the shared struggles of people. This is something that tempered liberalism is not so clear cut on. So I don't think that the difference between tempered liberalism and other forms of liberalism is purely in this regard. Although it is true that tempered liberals tend to be much more suspicious of or less enamored of the free market and less enamored of market mechanisms and less enamored of a sort of economistic conception of people and mode of analyzing human behavior than what we might call neoclassical liberals. I think that actual 19th century liberals also have a very different view from the view that certain so-called classical liberals in the 20th century hold. But it is the case that ideas of belonging, ideas of solidarity, ideas of the bonds between people do play an important role, especially for Camus, but for the others as well. So I do think that is one difference between tempered liberals and some classical liberals. At the same time, tempered liberals are, in a certain sense, highly individualistic in that they really emphasize the importance of respect for individual human beings and the dangers of subordinating individuals to collectives or to abstract ideals. They are highly individualistic in really emphasizing the importance of intellectual independence. One of the things that they are very critical of both anti-liberal movements and also other forms of liberalism for is seeking to subordinate individual critical judgment and imagination to ideology or to the demands of some collective movement. The idea that individuals should suppress their ideas or suppress their differences or their doubts and adhere to the party program is something that they really attack. And interestingly, that is something that they also find to be a problem in classical liberalism as it's articulated in the 20th century, both in the sense that some defenses of classical liberalism, at least, not all, I want to try to be fair here, but at least some defenses of classical liberalism that I've encountered and that they encounter really are a mirror image of Marxism in a certain sense, in that they involve this idea that there is a certain science of economics or a science of society. We have gotten it right. We know all the answers. We just need to put them into practice by convincing people to accept all of the answers that we have. And if people won't accept the answers that we have, we need to jettison democracy and find other ways of giving them the right programs. And this is something that all of these figures are deeply uncomfortable with and deeply critical of on the part of fellow liberals. They don't think that liberalism should be seen as an ideology based in claims to universal, complete scientific truth or certainty.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry for the interruption, but actually it is a sort of methodological differences between classic. If they think that it is the right way to do it, so we need to use every means to achieve these. And so, what about if we apply the same methodological changes into other ideologies in the dark times of their ideologies? For example, can we talk about the temperate socialism or conservative temperate conservatism? If they are just okay, we accept our differences, but this is our way. So isn't it the way of moving to social democracy, or maybe conservative democracy. Now they are in 1990s, and by the end of the 1980s, they were too popular in Europe and now in other part of the world. So what about if they claim that, okay, we use the liberal way of doing things in politics, but we are democratic socialist or the conservative democratic. So in that time, what is the difference between the liberal, temporal liberalism or other form of liberalism and the other anti-liberal ideologies? What would you say about it? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that, again, there is this idea that liberalism is defined by, at least as I define it, a concern for individual freedom, and individual freedom understood at least partly in terms of the ability to make choices about the conduct of one's own life, and also an idea of the importance of dividing and limiting power. And that brings with it, I think, a certain foundational set of institutional commitments. But there's a fair amount of room for flexibility in this. So I do think that liberalism of any sort does involve certain principles, certain practices of politics. While my account is in some ways quite close to Michael Walzer's recent book, in which he argues that we should stop talking about liberalism and start talking about liberal as an adjective, which qualifies other positions. So we should talk about liberal socialists, liberal Democrats, liberal feminists, liberal nationalists, etc.
They are now claiming.
So I think that there is something important about liberalism, which is this idea of limited and accountable government, and also this idea of individual freedom as not the only and not always the most important goal, but it's certainly as a very important goal, and it's a valid goal, which is not shared by all socialists or all conservatives, though it is shared by some. So I think that you certainly can talk about a liberal socialism or liberal conservatism or liberal nationalism. I think that furthermore, to the extent that these other ideologies are tempered in the same way, they come to be closer to liberalism, in that they come to accept more limitation, more restraint, more this self-limitation in the pursuit of certain goals. So a tempered socialism is actually, I think, something that many of these figures subscribe to in a certain way, or tempered social democracy. So certainly, I think that describes Camus' position. I think that the basic difference between liberals, let's say, whether they are tempered or not, whether they are liberals or not, and one thing that I want to suggest is that you can have illiberal liberals, and that this is a problem. That the basic difference between, just to take the two cases you mentioned of socialism and conservatism, the difference between a liberal, however tempered or qualified or sympathetic to elements of socialism, and a non-liberal socialist, is that liberals think that it's important to have some part of the economy that is not under the direct control of the government. Because if the government, the state, or for that matter, some other entity, the commune, has complete control of the economy or complete ownership of the means of production, this will undermine the ability of individuals to be protected against and to act independently of the state in a way that fundamentally threatens individual freedom. However, there are market socialists who accept this and say, we can have a combination of socialism of a certain sort with a market system. And I think, as best I can tell, there's nothing in tempered liberalism that would preclude that. And I would say that a socialist who embraces market socialism is already well on the road to being a tempered liberal. Now, there are other things that are important, such as certain political freedoms, a multi-party system, extensive freedom of speech, which is also crucial. So too with conservatism, I think that if a conservative believes in depriving individuals of extensive freedom of choice or personal autonomy in order to preserve certain traditional values and practices, that becomes anti-liberal.
You are trying to say that if we can talk about the tempered socialism or tempered conservatism, it means that they are actually closing to liberalism. So that's why they call themselves tempered socialism and other way around. Okay. So
yeah,
you still have your liberal stance at the center. If they are called in themselves in the different way, it doesn't matter that the methodologically actually they are closing the ideal methodology into the liberal way of doing politics.
Yes, and also I think this points to the way in which there can be not complete agreement, but at least cooperation or coalition between tempered liberals, tempered conservatives, tempered socialists, etc. So, conservative liberals and socialists who accept this shared need for self-limitation, self-restraint, tolerance, and so on. And they'll continue to have political disagreements and clashes and compete, but they also can at least recognize legitimacy and even a fair amount of wisdom among one another, and can therefore cooperate more, I think, than anti-liberal socialists or anti-liberal conservatives can with liberals.
Let me move on to another question. In the meantime, if you have any question from the audiences, you can just ask, because I am enjoying this conversation. That's why I am just trying to ask more questions as long as we have time for this session. But if you just, I think we have Dr. Plogber's question, but he is here as well. If you want, can you see the question on the right side in the chat side?
I can, yeah.
If you want, Dr. Plogber, if you want, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question, or
okay. I mean, it's already became a little more clearer what tempered liberalism means, because in the beginning I had a rather different understanding. In the beginning, I thought tempered liberalism is a response to challenge from different ideologies and to give aim to the pressure. Now I got the different understanding. So in this way, it becomes clearer to me what it means. Because in my first interpretation of tempered liberalism, when I listened in the beginning, it sounds like, somebody have a strong argument with you or start challenging you and to say, okay, I don't want to show the same aggressiveness as the challenger does, so I give in some to the position. That was my first impression. But in the discussion, the last 10 minutes, the understanding already changed a bit. So in this way, I wouldn't make the same question again. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think it's better just I ask another question, if you don't mind. While reading the book, I realized that all of the philosophers and thinkers you analyze in the dark times, they have different paths from the ideological point of view. So they had experienced maybe other political ideologies rather than the liberalism, and they have reserved and they have reservation to their own ideologies, and then they turn into the liberal perspective after the several developments in the 20th history. So do you think that it's some kind of pathway to be tempered liberal, to experience other ideologies first, then come up with the maybe eventual enlightenment of being a liberal or tempered liberal?
Yeah, no, I think that
if you don't mind, I would like to ask another question. Have you had? It's a personal question. If you don't have to ask it, but have you had that kind of experience?
Yeah. So
thank you.
I'm happy to talk about both parts of that. And so I think that part of the idea behind the label of tempered liberalism is the idea that it does involve a tempering through an encounter with other positions. And so not all of the figures that I look at did embrace an anti-liberal or even a non-liberal ideology or political position, but they certainly encountered it and were deeply shaped by it. And not only deeply shaped by it, but also deeply shaped by recognizing the appeal, recognizing the power and even the plausibility of these anti-liberal approaches. And to get it back to Dr. Plobler's question, which he then retracted, but which I think is still a good question. The approach wasn't one of appeasement or giving in, but it was one of saying, okay, there is something important here. There's something that we need to have a response to. And there are certain aspirations and certain dissatisfactions with liberalism that anti-liberals are moved by that are valid and that we do need to address. There also are, and this is where I think their personal experience of anti-liberalism from the inside, in some cases, was useful. There are also ways in which these aspirations towards justice, towards eradicating poverty, towards lifting up the oppressed and giving them power and dignity, when these are pursued by these anti-liberal movements, the movements wind up perverting or undermining these very goals. So Camus in Algeria becomes a member of the Communist Party because he sees the gross injustice of French colonial policy. He sees the gross injustice of global poverty, and he thinks that a liberal approach is insufficient, that liberalism is culpable, that it is implicated in all of these problems. And so he embraces communism. And then he finds himself being ordered by the Communist Party to betray his friends in the Algerian community, to trim and alter his political positions to suit the political goals or the political ambitions of the Communist Party. And he realizes that this approach of seeking power through the disciplined, authoritative party is not only anti-liberal, it's also anti-socialist in certain ways, or it's anti-egalitarian, it's anti-emancipatory. And so he starts a very long and agonized road to something that winds up being close to liberalism and encompassing certain fundamental elements of liberalism, though there remain certain socialist and anarchist elements in his thought. Similarly, in a very different way, with Reinhold Niebuhr, who embraces, and actually both Niebuhr and Héron, embrace a combination of socialism and pacifism after World War I. And they discovered that pacifism involves its own form, its own somewhat perverse form, perhaps, or surprising form of ruthlessness, the ruthlessness of saying, let justice be done though the earth perish. We are going to remain morally pure and disclaim the use of violence, even if that means letting Nazism win, even if that means we cannot stand up to anti-liberals. And Niebuhr and Héron both therefore think that there is something wrong about the moral absolutism or purism of pacifism, but also something wrong about the militancy of communism or the militancy of radicalism more broadly. And so they are seeking a liberalism that will be committed to change and committed to fighting against anti-liberalism, but that also is going to be much less dogmatic and less fanatical and less inflexible than its opponents. In my own case, to get to the personal part of that very quickly, I have always been some kind of liberal, I suppose, but I am a somewhat uncertain or anxious one. I do very much feel a push and pull. I feel the validity or the attraction of some of the claims of more radical politics. I sympathize with some of their aspirations and some of their dissatisfactions, but I also see a lot of, if sometimes dangerous or at least very disagreeably dogmatic, intolerant, and self-righteous features in those tendencies. But I will say just very quickly, because I know I want to get back to other people's questions. One thing that shaped the work on this project, which I spent a very long time on, so it was sort of born in a world quite different from the world that it's come out in. But one of the things that shaped it was the fact that in the early 2000s, I had a lot of friends who, after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and a couple of days past the anniversary of that, really embraced what we now call neoconservatism, and really embraced this idea of promoting more or less liberal democratic goals through the fairly unfettered use of American and allied, but primarily American force. And I was seeing this happen and being friendly with a lot of these people and feeling a lot of the same emotions as them as I was reading about 20th century radicals, and particularly Marxists, and thinking that actually there are certain ways of thinking. If you're not with us, you're against us. The party or the state has all the answers and just needs to bring them to bear on people who will be grateful once we have liberated them by force. So a lot of echoes there, and I thought this does point to the way in which the pursuit of liberal democratic ideals, which I myself share, can be undertaken in a very dangerous spirit, and that was, I think, really a germ for the later project.
Let me give another example to bring the history to the contemporary ages. You have Isaac Berlin's thought about Lenin's first reaction after the revolution. And according to Berlin's, Lenin just said, I just quoted from your book, people were too stupid and too blind to be allowed to proceed in the direction of their own choosing. So Lenin rejected the education of their people and established an authoritarian version. Maybe we can call this the proletariat dictatorship. So do you think that the current authoritarian regime or the current tendencies of authoritarianism in the world, do you think that they have the same or the similar methodology about education, or in the liberal way of doing politics and having some regulations in ideological way?
That's a difficult question for me, and so I'm not sure if I either quite follow the question or we'll be able to offer an adequate response to it. So I'll try to say something that I hope will get at the question, and if it fails,
no specific answer to the question.
You know,
so I am just wondering your ideas and your
no, but feel free to push back. So I think that one of the things that is difficult about liberalism and the liberal approach is that it does involve very often a slower and more partial way of getting places, which deeply dissatisfies people who are very determined to get to a certain result, and which also may be very poorly suited to situations where there is a need to get to a result quickly and effectively. And so in cases of emergency, in cases of the threat of civil war, in cases also of in the case that we now see of looming environmental catastrophe, it's easy to see why people would be deeply dissatisfied with an approach that is necessarily gradual, limited, somewhat more slow moving, is going to allow, even as it does impose certain policies and certain results, does still allow some room for hesitation. I think one of the important things about liberalism or liberal democracy is the idea that the party or the position that wins one day isn't going to win for all time. That, and this is one of the liberal democratic ways of maintaining peace. That you don't resort to war, because even if you lose the political fight today, you still have a chance to win later on. But that necessarily limits what governments can do, because there's always going to be a certain amount of opposition that has to be respected and tolerated in a given space. So I think that there are certain cases of emergency, and Aaron, among the figures I look at in particular, is sensitive to this. There are certain cases of emergency where you do need to temporarily move away from a sort of perfect adherence to liberalism, but not move away too far or too completely. And so there are two elements to this. One is that these more concerted and authoritative actions of keeping peace when you're on the verge of civil war, or suppressing certain insurrectionary forces, that there still be the preservation and the restoration very quickly of normal liberal democratic procedures and norms, that there remains an independent judiciary, that there remains legal appeals, that there remains accountability for government action, but also the ethical dimension of this, that we not say, okay, we need to embrace a ruthless attitude or a ruthless perspective on politics, but to rather say this is a tragic situation where we have to act in concerted ways and even authoritative ways that really are dangerous and that really are morally dubious, and that we should deeply regret, only adopt if we are absolutely out of other options, and that we should still feel bad about, still deplore, still try to make amends for and rectify later on.
Okay. Let me continue with the contemporary issue. It's really good. The book actually has, as you said, it was in the second contribution, I think. It really gives protection to the current world order and the current politics. So we had an epidemic within maybe long 3 years. So let me make an analogy between Albert Camus' work in the Plague and the current epidemic. So we have the states that they publicly and literally declared none of the states asked the people if they want the curfew, but they implemented the public curfews, and it was a sort of violation of the individual rights. You just think that you have the right to tell people that okay, you don't go out and it's forbidden or something like that. So what about, I know I have realized that from the book that the institutionalization is not at the center of the temperate liberalism. It might be part of the liberal ethos, but still not at the center, isn't it? If I'm correct. So it is about restricting institutions and states to provide liberal atmosphere and liberal ethos. What about if we have the social health versus individual rights?
Yeah.
What would you say is a temperate liberal in that situation?
Yeah, so I think that this is a very good and very difficult question, and I'll try to answer it briefly, since I know we're coming to the end of time, but will not therefore answer it adequately. But I think that there are two things that I do want to say here. First of all, Camus does write a book on the plague, at which many people turned to during the current plague or recent plague. And that is one of the places, to get back to your much earlier question, one of the places where the element of solidarity and the element of, this idea of shared suffering and shared struggle is very important in Camus' work. And I think that things like the pandemic do reveal some of the limitations of a purely individualistic conception. There clearly are ways in which individual actions deeply shape collective outcomes or collective fate. Now, this is not something that I think liberalism actually traditionally has much trouble with, in that all liberals recognize that there are going to be some needs occasionally for limitations to individual freedom. Mill's famous so-called harm principle, the idea that there should not be interference with self-regarding actions, as Mill calls them, but actions that cause harm to others can be regulated. Now, Mill himself, I think, has a somewhat shaky line that he draws, and many lines are a little blurry between self-regarding and other regarding actions. But still, in the case of the pandemic, there was a fairly clear sense in which certain actions that individuals took were deeply destructive of public health. At the same time, and this is where we get to the point of temperate liberalism, one thing that I found disturbing and disturbing in myself and in my own reactions was the way that people who were not understanding the challenges of the pandemic, or who were unhappy, as we all were, I think, with the limitations imposed by the pandemic, and who were responding with anger, with frustration, with defiance, these people were really vilified by a lot of liberals. And again, I think that there's a difference between saying, there may be a need to impose mask mandates or quarantines for some period of time until we have vaccines, until we have a better sense of what the danger is. That's one thing. Saying that people should always do whatever the government says without question, that there shouldn't be skepticism or resistance or investigations into the government's handling of things, saying that people who are unhappy with the mask mandate are evil or are murderers. That I think was an unhealthy, so to speak, result of pandemic politics. So too, I think, deeply exaggerated, if not hysterical, idea that the public health interventions, which were severe and were deeply frustrating, but which were enacted in a more limited way, that these public health interventions were tantamount to totalitarianism. Okay. So I think that both sides were driven by the stress and the fear of the pandemic. Were driven to really exaggerate the evils or the follies of the other side in that debate.
Okay, I have several more questions, but we have already completed now. If you don't mind, if you have time, I would like to ask two more questions. And there is hand raise, and the last question would be yours, if you don't mind, Dr. Provagar. It's fine. Okay. I would like to come to the liberal predicament now. That was the first question I have when I look at the book. Okay, we have now, maybe we call it another dark time in 21st century, because, we have far right and the leftist populist movement, extremely dogmatic, and maybe we call them the fanatic groups. They are now using the liberal way of doing politics as establishing a political party or association and foundation, and they are disseminating their ideas, and they are getting much more attraction comparing the previous years. So in US, in Europe, and the rest of the world, one of the titles in the conclusion, if I'm not wrong, let me check it out. It said, "Too liberal to fight or fighting liberally."
Mhm.
Yeah, when I just look at it, I just, okay, which way temperate liberalism would follow? Of course, it's gonna be fighting liberally, but how?
Mhm.
You know, it's really hard that people are really tend to attend or tend to believe to their far right ideologies and their extreme, maybe some Nazi groups in Germany. You know, they have just tried to make a coup d'etat and they just prevented it. And the Nazi groups in Ukraine as well. So in US. So how we handle this problem? So if it is liberal predicament, if there is nothing to do, or you think that, okay, we need to liberally fight, we are not too weak to fight. So which one do you prefer, and what's your ideas on it? Thank you.
Okay, so I think that this is where I'm going to not be able to offer very good solutions, but hopefully clarify
I
the
was just
problem.
wondering your idea. It's fine.
Yeah. So I think that figuring out how to fight liberally, how to fight anti-liberalism in a way that actually preserves liberalism and is consistent with liberalism is going to be very difficult now. And I think that while I look to history to think about the possibilities and the challenges to liberalism, this is a way in which history offers an insufficient guide, because the problem now is, I think, somewhat different from what it was in the 20th century. And that has a lot to do with social media. It's great that we can be together with many of you in Lisbon and elsewhere, and me here in Washington, D.C., and that's very nice. But the way in which the world is brought closer together does also provide opportunities for anti-liberals to coordinate and to learn from one another in ways that have been highly effective. And there is a fair amount of work now by political theory and political science colleagues of mine, such as Jan Werner Müller or Kim Lane Chappell, about the way in which anti-liberals have learned from one another and have coordinated. There's also the fact that in many liberal societies in the 20th century, there was some common discourse, some common cultural or discursive authority. People were getting their news from many of the same sources, and the news sources did differ quite a bit in some cases, but there was not quite the same existence, in some societies at least, the same existence of these bubbles or these silos in which people are just talking past one another, in which people are inhabiting fundamentally different realities or different perceptions of reality from one another. And finally, many of us do spend a lot of our time interacting with being exposed to not face-to-face, in-person people, but antagonists that we see on the screen. And that makes it very easy to dehumanize others, or to not see commonality with others, or to not recognize the claims of others. I think we all probably have felt the experience of it being much easier to be nasty and dogmatic when you're typing away at a invisible person on Twitter or on some other site, as opposed to talking to someone face to face in person and really responding to them as a human being. So I think all of this makes the plight of liberalism even more difficult in certain ways, and liberals are going to have to think very hard about how to overcome or counteract these tendencies. I do think that part of it, and I'll end in a moment and let you get on to the next question, but I do think that a part of it does need to be presenting much more of a positive vision. And one thing that so-called Cold War liberalism is often criticized for, and one thing that I do think that some of these thinkers are to be criticized for, and something that I fail to do as well, is to not offer a sufficiently compelling positive vision of what liberalism can give people, and to just focus on what the dangers are that liberalism is reacting against. And I think that we do need to insist on those dangers. Those dangers are real and important, and trying to show people that, you know, if they embrace Orban or Trump or AfD or whatever, that this is not going to bring them, you know, utopia, that this is not going to bring them paradise. This isn't even going to bring them the restoration of, you know, 1950s traditional values that many people want. But also saying, you know, there are certain goods that liberalism is very good at bringing, and ways in which liberalism really can still make people's lives better. So I do think that positive proposals and the positive vision does need to be a part of it.
Thank you very much. You know, my last question will be the last sentence of yours in your book. So it was, can we do better?
Mm-hmm.
So can we do any better? You know, I think you have already responded to how can we handle these far-right movements and the ideas. But if you would like to add something more, that would be great. Otherwise, I have completed my questions.
Okay, I do want to say just one thing about this question of can we do better, and one way in which I think we maybe can and should do better than the 20th century liberals I look at, which is that one thing that these liberals have been criticized for, and I think criticized correctly, though the criticism is sometimes exaggerated, is not being inclusive enough in their sort of span or realm of concern. Now, there are some ways in which they were pushing back against a lack of inclusivity on the part of their opponents, who are, you know, concerned with only the working class or only the revolutionary vanguard, etc. But it is true that they didn't always recognize the claims or the importance or urgency of the claims of those who had been traditionally excluded by liberal regimes. And I think that a big part of this, so certainly not the only part of it, did concern, while they weren't in favor of colonialism or imperialism, that they still tended to neglect or accept the subordination of the global South, of the you know, non-European and non-North American world. And so I think that one way in which liberals today hopefully can do better and really need to do better is to try to cultivate and sustain a much more truly global and more equal liberal movement or liberal coalition, where it isn't just you know, European or American, USA-ian liberals who are always sort of taking the lead and directing the fates of others.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, that raise another question, but I think that's enough, because I'm enjoying the talking and the asking and the getting answers about it. It was great for me. So I think I will stop here to asking questions. I have a couple of them more, but just enough for today. If we have another options and any place to meet face to face, then we extend our discussion. So still, Dr. Poeberger, do you want to ask a question, your question? And that will be last question of this session. Thank you. Yeah,
okay.
You can go ahead and ask. Thank you.
Yes, going back to the argument that COVID-19 and if as a fundamental challenge to humanity required some straightforward decision making, so me putting aside some liberal aspect. So what's the answer from tempered liberalism to climate change? Because basically climate change represents a similar fundamental challenge. So would you then argue you would also need a more streamlined decision making of addressing it? Because, like, for example, see what the sea level rise once happened, it takes hundreds of years, if at all, to change it back. So therefore, we're facing a situation which cannot be returned to the previous situation once it's happened. So what's the answer for tempered liberalism to that challenge, so to the challenge of climate change?
Sorry for interruption, Dr. Pavok. It was the tense of the question was making a judgment about, okay, liberals, what they are doing about the climate change, or just try to imply something else. But it's just a question. Joshua, it's it's up to you to respond or not, okay?
So I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's a question that really troubles and indeed agonizes me. I think that climate change may be the sort of thing that could potentially break temperate liberalism, in that it does present this truly existential threat to humanity, which does really require concerted and quick action, which many people are just refusing to take. And I think that there is a sort of the boy who cried wolf problem here, where many anti-liberals present everything as, or if not everything, then a lot of things as being these sorts of drastic challenges that liberalism can't address and that we can't, delay or compromise on. But just because that hasn't always been the case in the past, or that argument has been misused in the past, doesn't mean that it's not valid here. So I am sympathetic to the, and I worry that it's true that temperate liberalism is inadequate to deal with climate change. At the same time, I think that those who respond very understandably to the crisis that isn't just looming, that we're actually in, by advocating for, as a few of them, the more sort of extreme ones do, advocating for a form of war communism, as they say, or kind of global Leninism, that this isn't a good approach either, both because it will create, I think, a lot of reaction and a lot of conflict and a lot of resistance, and also because whether or not it solves the climate problem, it will then leave us with an incredible amount of power concentrated in the hands of people who are convinced that they are absolutely right and convinced that their opponents are stupid or evil or both. And that's a very dangerous thing too. So I think that we do need to be fighting very hard to try to affect climate solutions or responses to climate change. I think that we need to be saying that those who deny climate change or deny that it's a serious problem are stupid or evil in this regard, at least, or if not evil, at least they are, doing things, embracing policies that are deeply destructive for humanity, but not throw away either the acceptance of the need to tolerate and deal with disagreement, or the need to continue operating within democratic institutions. And the problem with democracy, the problem with liberalism, is that you ultimately do have to hope that human beings will choose to do the right thing at crucial moments. And we will see if we can make that happen.
Okay, then
doesn't look very promising for the time being that people doing the right thing.
Yeah, at least we have to give them the choice, the right to choice, and then we expect them to choose the right one. So that's the fate of humanity. Okay, thank you very much, Joshua. It was really interesting, and I have quite enjoyed it. I wish we could have much more time to discuss these things. Maybe it's because of my area of expertise close to that political thought So it's fine. Thank you very much for attending. And we're supposed to have a closing session, but we just couple of people here. And if you don't mind, I will just take the lead and close this session and also entire the conference for this year. Okay, 2 days ago, we had started with the opening speech of the Professor Nicola Ruiz from Birmingham University, UK. And from that moment now, we got completed 11 panels, 1 keynote speech, and 1 in conversation, and lastly, a book discussion with Joshua Cherniss. So I would like to thank all the participants from the moment the conference started and until now. And my special thanks goes to the right now who attended the meeting, because you know, it will be quite different, difficult and awkward to close without any audiences. And I would like to thank the organizers, CESRAN International, which I am part of it. President of CESRAN International is here, Özgür Tüfekçi, and also hosting university, and also co-organizer of this event, ULA in Portugal, Lisbon. Luis Tome is also representing the institution and also head of the department in international relations in this university. I would like to thank special thanks to them, and that's it for this year and for this night. Thank you very much for your all efforts, contributions, for everything. And Joshua, I hope we will meet again into CESRAN 2024.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you so much for letting me join.
Yeah, you might have another book to discuss, and then we might arrange another book discussion session for that. Thank you very much for everything, and see you next year. Bye for now. Thanks.